Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get ready to do it. First, we have, did Rubio admit that Israel dragged us into war with Iran, posted by Red Apple 655321, and they said, Dave Smith's takes are hit or miss for me, but in his recent episode he shared a clip of Marco Rubio, which seems to admit that Israel is responsible for getting us into a war with Iran, though he did walk it back the following day. I found some other articles and commentary about this, but this seems like a really big deal. Why isn't everyone talking about this? Isn't this not as big a deal as I think it is? And my thoughts on that would be, I would say, it really isn't that big a deal at this point because that's pretty much par for the course of anything. Donald Trump, his campaign was built on America first, but he comes into office like pretty much all the recent presidents, and it's all about Israel first. And, that just goes to show you that, a lot of times, Israel's the one really pulling the strings. And it's definitely not that surprising. That's why I don't think everyone's really talking about it. I do try and retweet as much, criticism of Israel as possible on my Twitter feed. But ultimately, it's really nothing that out of the ordinary. Sadly, Israel's pretty much Israel's pretty much gonna. The U.S. will pretty much do anything for Israel as long as the backlash won't be too severe and. That's how the relationships between the two states has historically been. I would say going back to the formation of the modern day state of Israel in 1948, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the Iranian ship was there because India invited it to the Milan naval exercise, and under the rules, it was not carrying ammunition. Despite this, a U.S. submarine attacked and sank the defenseless ship. Posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the underreported news subreddit. I guess that's looks like a video of that happening on like a diagram of the ocean in that area. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be sinking defenseless Iranian ships. But ultimately, the U.S. the U.S. military can justify doing pretty much whatever it wants to, just like every other branch of the U.S. government, pretty much, because they have the legal monopoly on the use of force on their side, and. Iran, I guess they have their legal monopoly of force on their side too, and they can do a lot of things without being held accountable. But the U.S. is ultimately one of the most powerful governments in the world. I'm sure if this reverse happened, Iran, the Iranian Navy sank a defenseless American ship. The Donald Trump and all of his government would be up in arms about it. But the U.S. government can just sink a defenseless Iranian ship, and it's just kind of people will just move on to whatever the next thing is. It just goes to show you that people will let their government pretty much get away with whatever they want, whatever. If I sank that ship, even though we are kind of at war with Iran currently, if I sank that ship as an individual, I'd probably be held up as a war criminal. But the U.S. government does it, and it's pretty much just any other day. And it just goes to show you, it's pirates and emperors. When the individual does something, it's a crime. But when the government does something, it's just the law. Next, we have what will cost of living soars and healthcare taken away. Trump spending $1 billion per day in war of choice with Iran from commondreams.org, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But, ultimately the U.S. government can spend money on whatever it wants to spend money on, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. If they want to spend all their billions of dollars on constantly bombing Middle East for decades, that's their prerogative. I personally think, I don't really care for state involvement in healthcare, but, if I think if people do want to have the government spend money on healthcare rather than pointless wars in the Middle East, I think that would probably be a much better thing. And yeah, I think the libertarian position is you got to have voluntary taxation where taxpayers are able to earmark where their money goes to, rather than what we have now, where pretty much the government can spend taxpayer dollars on whatever pointless bullshit it wants to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Central Command preparing for Iran war to last until fall. Report from NewsNationNow.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't know if it's going to last that long. We'll have to wait and see. I personally am kind of the mindset that, nothing ever happens. I think they'll probably wrap it up relatively soon. I don't think there's going to be boots on the ground because, boots on the ground, as I talked about in a previous episode, were disastrous for the Republican Party when it came to the Iraq war. So we'll have to wait and see. I personally think it's just going to be it's gonna calm down soon, and it's just gonna be strikes every couple months, kind of like what happened the last time, and then they strike him back in May 2025, and then they struck him again recently. I mean, it's just going to be strikes every couple of months, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens on that front. Next, we have Florida legislators advance a bill authorizing government surveillance based on views or opinions from Reason.com, hosted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, I don't think that's very good, but the government's probably surveying you regardless of what your views or opinions are already. It's just probably another government surveillance program. I'm sure if Florida was a progressive state and the bill was authorizing government surveillance based on transphobic views or racist views or homophobic views or whatever, or phobic, the left feels like saying on any given day. Reddit would think this is the greatest thing ever, but since it's the out group passing the bill rather than the in group, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. And that just goes to show Reddit, they don't really care about what people are doing rather than who's doing it. As I said, if this was the in group passing the exact same bill, maybe switch the groups around that they're surveying based on views or opinions. Reddit would love this, but since it's the out group, Reddit has to hate it. Next, we have Trump's War original title from Time.com, posted by Dr. Who 07. And yeah, personally, I think, if the media wants to frame this as Trump's war, I think that's fine. And I think in a lot of respects it is. But I would frame this much more as Netanyahu's war than Trump's war. I think he's the one really pulling the strings here rather than Trump. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have lawsuit. Trump's newest tariffs are an exercise of completely unrestrained executive power from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, I would agree with that. But ultimately, a lot of people are going to defer to whatever the executive branch and the president say, regardless of what the other branches of government say. And sadly, this is the end result of that. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what's written down in regards to laws, but rather what people are willing to justify enforcing, and a lot of people are going to justify enforcing whatever the president says to enforce. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Congress just quietly reintroduced Kids Online Safety Act as H.R. 7757 to end anonymous web browsing for adults from Lustra.news, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, if the government does want to end anonymous web browsing for adults, I personally think if you want to browse anonymously or post anonymously, I think you should be able to. But ultimately, the government, they can set whatever rules they want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Since they have the legal monopoly of force, justify enforcing whatever they want to. I guess you could always try and maybe browse in like incognito mode or something, or I don't know, or find a way around it with like a VPN. But ultimately, even those, the government could probably still find ways around those if it felt like it, and that just goes to show you that the government, since they have the ability to justify whatever they want to, and the law on their side, oftentimes there's really nothing you can do about something when they want to do something that you might not like, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have jobs are down while the U.S. spends $2 billion today on war with Iran from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, as I said, I personally don't really care about the U.S. throwing money at Iran at the Iran war. But personally, it just goes to show you that the U.S. government is much more interested in foreign affairs than domestic ones. Trump was interesting. His campaign was pretty much, we got to stop policing the world and start refocusing on domestic affairs. But ultimately, just like all the other presidents, he like Obama, he said he's going to bring change. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what knuckleheads in the White House. The U.S. is gonna keep reading the world police anyway. And ultimately, it just goes to show you, I would say the president's mostly just a figurehead rather than an actual position of authority. The CIA, FBI, and other deep state actors are the ones really running the country and making the decisions. I think that's very important to note as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump drops bombshell in Iran, unconditional surrender or nothing, and he's already picked their next leader from RealmWire.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't know if Trump should be doing that. He should be forcing unconditional surrender. But if the U.S. government wants to justify enforcing unconditional surrender, ultimately it has the ability to justify pretty much, as I stated numerous times, the ability to justify whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next we have there is no war in Bossing Say, and that's and that's a YouTube link from C-SPAN. Speaker Mike Johnson, our Louisiana on Iran after failed war powers vote. We're not at war. And that's posted by Woke Boogeyman. That's cross posted from the video subreddit. Mike Johnson, after the House blocked the War Powers Act, a resolution on U.S. actions in Iran. We're not at war. We have no intention of being at war. The President, Department of Defense made it very clear this is a limited operation. And yeah, personally, I don't really care that the U.S. is at war and trying to deny it. The U.S. is kind of always at war and trying to deny it. The U.S. is always bombing some country in the Middle East. They don't. It's not usually Iran, but it's usually like Syria or Afghanistan or Libya. And it just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter what the current administration is, or it just goes. The U.S. is going to justify bombing whatever country it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. If you want to call it war, I'd say with the U.S. government has been at war in the Middle East for decades at this point. But ultimately, the U.S. if the people don't want to call it war, I would agree that it's more par for the course than anything at this point. Also ultimately, if you want to call it war, or don't want to call it war, use whatever terms you want, terms and labels you want to. It doesn't really matter in the long run because the U.S. is going to keep up the same foreign policy it always does, regardless of what you're going to label it and regardless of who's in power. Next we have Occam's Razor, Our Island, Our World Through the Eyes, pen of S.C. Watson from TheoCarsonian.com, posted by Plasman30, and that looks like a cartoon, and it's a political cartoon. It's Donald Trump, and he's standing over behind ahead of a banner that says Iran War, and behind him is a bunch of files labeled Epstein files. And yeah, I'd agree with that. The Iran War might be kind of covering up for the Epstein files. I do think, Israel is definitely involved in the Epstein stuff. Epstein, I heard Jeffrey Epstein might have been a Mossad agent. That's kind of like Israel's CIA. And that's why I think Israel might have also wanted the war with Iran. Just like Donald Trump probably wants the war with Iran for that similar reason. And it just goes to show you that, it doesn't really matter, in the long run, why they're doing the war, though. They just want to hide and distract from how they're all guilty and probably shouldn't be in power in the first place. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have When the State Police Shoots a Civilian in the Back, posted by Fasty Rubenus 739, and that's a cross post from the Narco-Capitalism subreddit. And that looks like a screenshot. It says, Vance says ICE agent involved in Minneapolis shooting will have absolute immunity. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. But, ultimately the government can give immunity to whatever government actors it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they control the courts and legal system as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump bragged about lower gas prices, then he bombed Iran from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think Trump should be bombing Iran. We should be focusing more on the home front, but ultimately, as since the Second World War, the U.S. government's really been the world police rather than caring about any issues on the home front, and I think that's important to to remember as well. People always say, "Oh, Trump's this unique evil," when in reality, I would say Trump is much more par for the course than anything. The U.S. is going to bomb the Middle East regardless of what figurehead is in power, and that's my thoughts there. Next we have Good Point Donnie, What Happened Next? And that looks like an old tweet from Donald Trump from 2019, October 9, 2019. The United States has spent $8 trillion fighting and policing the Middle East. Thousands of our great soldiers have died or been badly wounded. Millions of people have died on the other side. Going into the Middle East is the worst decision ever made. And I'd agree with that, but like a lot of politicians, Donald Trump's going to say one thing and then do the opposite. If he was really America first, he'd be working on getting troops out of the Middle East and abroad and focusing more on issues on the home front. But in reality, he's much more Israel first than America first, just like a lot of the other recent presidents. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump says he won't sign any bills into law until SAVE Act passes from thehill.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, personally, if Trump doesn't want to sign any bills into law, if he wants to justify that, that's fine. But he was never really the type to sign a lot of bills from Congress. He's much more the type to govern by executive order, kind of like Obama and Biden does. That's kind of the MO these days. They don't usually do bills anymore. It's usually more executive order that the president governs by. So I don't think this will have too much of an effect in that because of that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.